First of all, I want to thank Professor Andrew Porwancher. I want to thank him personally, publicly, for being one of our affiliated faculty who just contributes so much to our program in the last couple of years, and this is just as without even digging into the paper, this is just off the top of my head. Andrew has organized organized a visit by Eric Nelson of Harvard, who spoke really interestingly on biblical Hebraism with the Institute for American Constitutional Heritage in the Schusterman Center. He has spoken 3 times at these Just Lunches. This will be the 3rd on American quotas in the 1920s, which has, of course, reemerged in the last year as still a major issue in American higher education. I thought, and Andrew confirmed, that he actually debuted his upcoming book on the Jewish founder Alexander Hamilton's hidden life with Harvard University Press. Andrew debuted it at one of these Just Lunch talks a few years ago. He's organizing a panel at the upcoming Association of Jewish Studies. He is the keynote speaker for the Oklahoma City Interfaith Council 2 days before Thanksgiving. And just whatever Andrew is ready to stand up and speak and share his formidable knowledge with us. Professor Porwancher received his BA with summa cum laude from Northwestern, his MA from Brown University, his PhD from the University of Cambridge. He has already assembled a impressive list of publications, including John Henry Wigmore and the Rules of Evidence, The Hidden Origins of Modern Law, Scribes Book Award for Best Work of Legal Scholarship. He published in the same year with Oxford University Press, The Devil Himself, A Tale of Honor, Insanity, and the Birth of Modern America, and is, I believe, nearly done, altogether done with the Jewish founder Alexander Hamilton's hidden life with Harvard University Press. Well, if you've heard Professor Porwancher speak before, I don't need to say another word, and if you haven't, well, I assure you you're in for a treat.
Thank you. I want to thank Dr. Levinson for that introduction and for inviting me now for the 3rd time in my 8 years at OU to participate in this Just Lunch series as a speaker, and for warmly welcoming me as an affiliated faculty member of the Schusterman Center for Judaic and Israel Studies. There are a number of universities around the country that have Jewish studies programs, of course. There are some that have constitutional studies. The University of Oklahoma is the only institution in America that has both. How's that for a stat? So there's no better place to be working at the intersection of Jewish history and America's constitutional and political heritage. So I'm thrilled to be here today, and I want to thank all of you for coming. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us in the Frontier Room, and I appreciate that. Now, some of you may have been here a few years ago when I laid out my evidence for Alexander Hamilton's Jewish ancestry. And so I want to be very upfront that Theodore Roosevelt was not a Jew. Or was he? No, he wasn't. I checked. If anything, he was a consummate insider of the Protestant elite then dominating American life in his era. His father was a 4th-generation descendant of an illustrious Dutch-American family. His mother, a Southern belle of such renown that many believed her to be the inspiration for the character of Scarlett O'Hara in Gone with the Wind. Their son Theodore lived a life consistent with this patrician upbringing, enrolling at Harvard, serving as an officer in the military, and seizing the grandest prize of all, the Oval Office. his journey would have been strikingly unrelatable to the countless Jewish immigrants then pouring into his native New York. And yet, Theodore Roosevelt formed a bond with American Jewry never before seen in the history of the American presidency. It is an untold story. Remarkably, no book exists on this topic, an omission that I hope to correct. Now, to understand Roosevelt's adult relationship with Jewry, we have to understand his childhood. He was born in New York City on East 20th Street in Manhattan's Flatiron District. And as a boy, he suffered from a crippling asthma condition. His father told him, "Theodore, you have the mind, but you have not the body." And the father instilled in his son an abiding determination to overcome this malady. As we will see, Roosevelt saw in American Jews a similar path from frailty to fortitude. Roosevelt's relationships with Jews is also inseparable from his Christian upbringing. He came of age during the rise of the social gospel movement, a strand of Protestantism that preached the alleviation of social ills as a hallmark of Christian faith. As a boy, he attended the sermons of William Adams, a renowned social gospel enthusiast whose ecumenical spirit called on his fellow New Yorkers to embrace, not shun, impoverished immigrants. And Roosevelt's worldview in general, and his approach to Jewry in particular, was deeply informed by the social gospel, with its belief in the perfectibility of man, the rectitude of humanitarian reform, and the exceptionalism of America. And the final element of Roosevelt's childhood I'll mention is a trip he took to Jerusalem with his family as part of a far-flung tour of the Ottoman Empire. And he visited in Jerusalem the Kotel, the holiest site in all of Judaism, which you may know as the Western Wall or the Wailing Wall. And Roosevelt, although he was only 15 years old, he was savvy enough at that young age to observe that the women were taking their devotions more seriously than the men. He recorded in his diary, "Many of the women were in earnest, but most of the men were evidently shamming." Roosevelt went on to attend Harvard. He won election to the New York State Legislature at the age of 24. And he then pursued a career as a cowboy in North Dakota. He returned to New York, and by the age of 37, he had been placed as the commissioner of the New York City Police Department. He, from this perch, took pains to promote Jews to his force, not despite the fact that they were Jewish, but indeed because of it. He wanted a force that was, in his words, quote, thoroughly representative of the great city itself. For a Jewish community in New York that had escaped persecution overseas, the image of a Jewish American policeman was a powerful symbol of acceptance. An important test of Roosevelt's tenure as police commissioner came early in 1895, when Hermann Alvard, the German member of parliament and virulent anti-Semite, planned a trip to New York. Now, Alvard had long suggested that a secret cabal of Jews was somehow responsible for most of the political crises in Europe. So he was not the most original of anti-Semites. He described Jews as a disease that needed to be eradicated from German society. And now he sought to bring these ideas to American soil. Now, Roosevelt found Alvard's ideology repugnant, but he knew that if he prevented Alvard from speaking, he would do violence to the principle of free speech and make Alvard a martyr for his cause. And so when Alvard came to New York and requested a police detail, Roosevelt does something ingenious. He assigns him 40 police officers. Every single one of them was Jewish. Now, the image, the optics of Jewish policemen protecting Alvard's speech freedoms did more to undermine his hateful message than preemptive censorship ever could have. Roosevelt described this episode as, quote, an object lesson to our people, whose greatest need it is to learn that there must be no division by class hatred, be it creed against creed, nationality against nationality, section against section. Roosevelt is remembered today in part for his fixation on masculinity. In Roosevelt's era, the ideal of the rugged, individualistic, self-made man was losing purchase. The economy had undergone rapid industrialization, the workforce acute professionalization. The autonomy that had been enjoyed by the farmer or craftsman of an earlier era had given way to the straitjacketed regimentation of the factory laborer and the white-collar bureaucrat. And so it was in this context that the preservation of American manhood became a source of acute cultural anxiety, both for the nation at large and for Theodore Roosevelt in particular. For some, this anxiety took on racial and ethnic overtones. Immigrants became something of a Rorschach test that people projected their anxieties about masculinity onto. The most popular publication on race in the era, Madison Grant's The Passing of the Great Race, shuddered at, quote, the Polish Jew with his dwarf stature. But for Roosevelt, whatever concerns about masculinity he had did not translate into nativism. Indeed, he saw in Jewry the same stigma around physicality that he himself had suffered from as a boy, and he saw the same resolve to overcome that stigma. He particularly identified with the sons of Eastern European Jewish immigrants who flocked to American boxing gyms in a bid to push back against the stereotype of the enfeebled peasant from the shtetl. He praised the, quote, Jew of fine bodily powers who had taken to boxing, wrestling, and the like. Indeed, Roosevelt's sparring partner was the Jewish prize fighter Otto Raphael. And when Raphael tried out for Roosevelt's police force, out of nearly 400 applicants, he finished 10th in the mental exam and 1st in the physical exam. And indeed, he earned his spot on the force. He and TR became lifelong friends. As Roosevelt put it, he and I were both straight New York, to use the vernacular of our native city. It is telling that Theodore Roosevelt believed Jews would fulfill the ideal of manly courage not by shedding their Jewishness, but by adhering to what he saw as the most masculine icons of their own history, the Maccabees, who had wrested from Antiochus, Judea, in the 2nd century. When I was on, and I'll mention that he, when he was recruiting Jews for the police force, he was specifically looking for, in his words, the Maccabee or fighting type of Jew. When I was on sabbatical at Yeshiva University last year, I had floated the idea of adopting the fighting Jew as a mascot, and I found that the faculty were less enthused than the undergrads. Now, when war breaks out in 1898 between the U.S. and Spain, Roosevelt formed a cavalry regiment known as the Rough Riders to fight the Spanish in Cuba. They had 20,000 applicants for 1,000 spots, and so Roosevelt could choose to be highly selective. And he put his pluralism into practice, deliberately mixing Texas cowboys with Harvard alumni, Italians with Indians, Jews with Gentiles. The New York Times reported that, quote, Mr. Roosevelt surveys with pride the diversity of his personnel. One of his Jewish soldiers was known by the ironic nickname Pork Chop. Roosevelt's battlefield successes gained him wide renown, and he was able to translate these military heroics into a successful bid for the governorship of New York. And interestingly, Roosevelt's campaign, in its efforts to court Jewish voters, described the Spanish-American War as comeuppance against a Spanish nation that had shed Jewish blood in the Inquisition 400 years earlier. A Yiddish flyer from the campaign read, "Who takes revenge for us? Vote for Theodore Roosevelt. Vote to express your approval of Spain's defeat." Roosevelt quickly ascended to the vice presidency. And on the heels of William McKinley's assassination, Theodore Roosevelt became the youngest head of state in American history at the age of 42. During his first term, a brutal pogrom broke out against the Jews of Kishinev in the Russian Empire. Local officials in Kishinev watched passively as the townsfolk slaughtered Jews by the dozens, injured Jews by the hundreds, and displaced their Jewish residents by the thousands. Roosevelt met with the distraught leaders of B'nai B'rith, the oldest Jewish service organization in America, and he committed himself to their cause, becoming the first and only head of state anywhere in the world to speak out against the Kishinev pogrom. And although the Russian Tsar remained unmoved, Roosevelt's actions did much to assure the American Jewish community of where their president stood on the question of anti-Semitism. As B'nai B'rith's leader wrote to TR, quote, "Your Jewish fellow citizens at home and abroad bless you. You have lifted the veil, and the light of reason and humanity is streaming in." So, soon thereafter, at an address in Carnegie Hall, Roosevelt expressed his view that he had a particular obligation as the President of the United States to speak out against the plight of Jews anywhere in the world. He said, "The lamentable and terrible suffering to which so many Jewish people in other lands have been subjected makes me feel it my duty, as the head of the American people, to express my deepest sympathy." During Roosevelt's second term, the American Jewish Committee, or AJC, formed in response to continued outrages against Jews overseas. The leadership of the AJC tended to be more established German Jews, but their main source of concern were those Eastern European Jews facing persecution abroad. And in Roosevelt, the AJC found a willing partner whose ecumenical spirit saw Jews as allies in his great project of reform. Now, I should mention at this time that a number of Americans were willing to accept more established Jewish families who had been in the country for several generations, who came from Western Europe originally, who were better educated, who were more affluent, but they expressed real skepticism at these strange Eastern European Jewish newcomers. But Theodore Roosevelt notably embraced both groups. He said that American Jews, and I'm quoting here, "strive for the maintenance of the principles embodied in our Constitution. This is not only true of the Jewish descendants of the early settlers and those of American birth, but of a great and constantly increasing proportion of those who have come to our shores in the last 25 years. As refugees, reduced to the direst straits of penury and misery." Roosevelt then made history in his second term as president by appointing the first Jew in history to a presidential cabinet. The individual selected for this honor was the German-born Jew Oscar Strauss, who was representing the United States at an international court in Holland. And Roosevelt told Strauss that he was choosing him for this honor in part to send a message to the world. In Roosevelt's own words, "I want to show Russia and some other countries what we think of Jews in this country." Strauss was chosen to head the Department of Commerce, which had been created in Roosevelt's first term, and its purview included not only business regulation, but also immigration. And so, the fact that Roosevelt put a foreign-born Jew in charge of the immigration portfolio is astounding in the context of these times. These were decades when America was experiencing a massive influx of immigration, many of them Jews, many not. The Jewish population mushroomed from some 250,000 to over 2 million in these years. Roosevelt's hometown of New York became fully 28% Jewish. Immigrants of the Gilded Age and Progressive Era did not come from those traditionally Northern and Western European countries where most native-born Americans could trace their ancestry. They were instead from the less familiar lands of Southern and Eastern Europe and Asia and the Middle East. Some native-born Americans were bewildered by these strange foreigners of uncertain ethnicity, speaking in alien tongues from strange lands. In the eyes of some, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant core of the nation seemed to be under threat. American identity itself appeared to be under siege. Some reactionaries lashed out at immigrants, with Jews taking a large brunt of that discrimination. A nativist spoke for many when he expressed the fear that, quote, the craftiness of the Jew and his success as a schemer will allow him to get a hold of the purse strings of the nation. Now, it is in this volatile political context that Roosevelt made the audacious decision to put the foreign-born Jew, Oscar Strauss, in charge of administering America's immigration policy. Strauss declared, quote, the right of the human being to move from one part of the earth to the other is a fundamental element of personal liberty. As you might imagine, many of those working underneath Strauss held more restrictionist views, and he invoked his authority as Commerce Secretary to overturn countless denials at America's ports. He even hired private investigators to slip into Ellis Island and ferret out prejudiced immigration officers. In Roosevelt's post-presidential years, he lent his support to a group of Jewish women who were striking in New York's East Village. These were largely immigrant women working on subsistence wages who were protesting their unsanitary working conditions. It was effectively a sweatshop. And just a half-mile away, 2 years earlier, the notorious Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire had claimed 146 lives, a disproportionate number of them Jewish women. Roosevelt, who was now removed from public office and seeking no votes, descended on the strike. Now, young ladies, he told the strikers, I want to know all about your lives. Gather around me and tell me your stories. One 15-year-old Jewish girl told the former president how New York's blue laws worsened an already difficult situation for Jews like her. She was prevented by her faith from working on Saturday and forbidden by the law from working on Sunday. And so she could work 1 day fewer than her Gentile counterparts, which amounted to 7 weeks' worth of income a year. She was only making $3.50 a week, around $180 a year. In today's dollars in 2018, that would be around $4,500 annually, far below the poverty wage. Touched by these workers' plight, Roosevelt took up their cause with the New York State Legislature and pleaded with the Speaker of the State Assembly, these girls are to be the future mothers of our American citizenship. In Roosevelt's eyes, the problem with these immigrants was not their old world ways, but rather the dehumanizing conditions they had been subjected to in the New World. In 1918, at the twilight of Roosevelt's life, as the Great War drew to a close, Zionists who were emboldened by Britain's Balfour Declaration lobbied for international recognition of an independent, sovereign Jewish state. Roosevelt emerged as an early and prominent supporter of their cause, suggesting that the Jews not only have their own state, but that such a state be in the land where their biblical ancestors had ruled. In Roosevelt's words, it is entirely proper to start a Zionist state around Jerusalem, and that the Jews be given control of Palestine. Now, this support for a Jewish state had a Christian inflection. Traditionally, Roosevelt was associated with Christian missionaries who liked his interventionist foreign policy, who shared his belief in spreading ideals around the world. But on the question of Zionism, many of these Christian missionaries broke with Roosevelt. They feared that support for a Jewish homeland might jeopardize their work in those lands still under Ottoman control. Instead, Roosevelt found himself allied with evangelical Christians who had a deep Zionist strand in their history. Roosevelt's own Zionism illustrates the difficulties of pigeonholing him into conventional categories in the landscape of American Christianity. So, all in all, Roosevelt liked Jews. What of it? Does this story have any broader significance or meaning? Theodore Roosevelt scholars debate what kind of melting pot Roosevelt sought. Some suggest he wanted a whites-only melting pot. It couldn't be Anglo-Saxon only because he wasn't Anglo-Saxon. He was, in his words, Old Dutch Knickerbocker stock. But other scholars have pushed back against that traditional narrative and suggested that Roosevelt's melting pot could include Native Americans and African Americans. Today, I want to push back against the very premise of that debate and suggest that Roosevelt did not embrace a melting pot at all. Indeed, his relationships with American Jews illustrates his pluralistic rather than homogenized vision of the country. He wanted Americans to harmonize, not efface their different subcultures. Consider this speech that Roosevelt gave to the Jewish community in 1905. He said, "I am glad to be able to say, in addressing you on this occasion, that while the Jews of the United States, who now number more than 1 million, have remained loyal to their faith and race traditions, they have become indissolubly incorporated into that great army of American citizenship. For Roosevelt, Jewish Americans need not choose between being Jewish and being Americans. He called on Jews to draw from, not shed, their heritage. By embracing Jews as an integral part of the American experiment, Roosevelt forcefully refuted those contemporaries of his who saw Jews as a threat to national identity. The question that Roosevelt sought to answer, in both word and deed, is the question that lies at the heart of the Jewish American experience. The question of whether America can be a home for its Jews in perpetuity. Consider the long history of the Jewish diaspora, from Baghdad to Berlin, from Portugal to Paris, from Amsterdam to Austria. In so many cities and countries, we have seen flourishing Jewish communities that ultimately gave way to persecution, to expulsion, to violence. And sometimes, for a few generations or even a few centuries, a Jewish community can thrive before succumbing to the seemingly inevitable scourge of anti-Semitism. And so the question of whether America can be a permanent home for its Jews is a radical one, because it asks whether amid all the nations of the diaspora where Jews have migrated, is America somehow unique? Or is the golden age of American Jewry destined to the same fate that has befallen so many other Jewish communities in other lands before? American Jews have enjoyed remarkable prosperity in America in all senses of the word. And under normal circumstances, it is tempting to dismiss anti-Semitism as the vestige of another place and another time, of an earlier century and a different continent. And yet, the question of Jewish belonging in America has been thrust upon us with new salience these past 2 weeks. Normally, in a public lecture on history, I would have neither occasion nor the desire to comment on current events or strike a personal note, but I hope you'll indulge me briefly just this once, because I want to try to tie these threads together. In the aftermath of the massacre at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh's Squirrel Hill neighborhood, there were a couple articles in particular that caught my attention, both of which concerned the reaction of the Jewish community in Squirrel Hill. Some Jews turned inward to their fellow Jews, to the process of grieving, to the ancient Jewish rituals surrounding death. Jewish tradition requires that the bodies of the deceased not be left alone. They must be guarded until they are ready for their funerals. The Atlantic Monthly published a piece describing those Jews who volunteered for that somber task in Squirrel Hill. Quote, "They read the Psalms in order, one after another, with each person making sure the next guard knew where the readings had left off. Everyone had a different way of praying. One man stood facing the wall, rocking slowly from one foot back to the other. End quote. So while some Jews turned inward, others turned outward to the larger society and sought to rend from the clutches of this tragedy some force for positive change in the world. The Washington Post described a local Jewish woman who attended a civic-minded gathering in Squirrel Hill in the days after the slaughter. Quote, Kara Bernstein, who lives near Tree of Life and was at another house of worship during Saturday's massacre, went with two friends to urge people to vote. I can't pretend to offer you much in the way of scholarly dispassion or academic objectivity on this topic, because the man described in that Atlantic article praying by the wall is my brother-in-law, Jonathan. And the woman mentioned in the Washington Post piece is my sister, Kara. For years, they have been pillars of Squirrel Hill's Jewish community. The Tree of Life is a short walk from their home. Indeed, Kara passes it every day on her walk to work at the University of Pittsburgh, where she's a member of the faculty. As you might imagine, every year I have many occasions to spend Shabbats with them and their 3 young children in Squirrel Hill. And anyone who knows that neighborhood knows that it seems that there's a synagogue on every block, and while most Jews formally belong to only one congregation, on any given Saturday, you could be found at any of Squirrel Hill's many synagogues to attend a friend's bat mitzvah or a neighbor's bris. And so perhaps you can imagine the dread that I felt the moment I heard that a synagogue in Squirrel Hill had become the site of a mass murder. Perhaps you can imagine the relief I felt when we finally got word from Kara. And perhaps you can imagine the sorrow that I felt in speaking to Kara about how she was going to explain to her 5-year-old daughter that just a few blocks from their home, 11 people were slaughtered merely for doing what my 5-year-old niece does with her parents every Saturday morning. And here's my point. Here's why I share my story with you today. If America is to be a home for its Jews in perpetuity, then it must necessarily be the case that you need not have a sibling belong to a synagogue in Squirrel Hill to see that that massacre is an assault on your own religious liberty. That if a Jew in Pittsburgh is butchered merely for exercising the freedom to worship, that your own religious freedom is now in jeopardy. And that's not just a soundbite. It's not just an empty platitude. It is a provable historical fact. Consider 1654. It was in this year that the first Jewish community came to American soil. 23 Jews fleeing religious persecution. They came to the island of Manhattan, which was then part of New Amsterdam, a Dutch colony. And immediately, the governor of that colony, Peter Stuyvesant, sought permission from his higher-ups in Holland to expel these Jews. He asked that, quote, this deceitful race, such hateful enemies and blasphemers, be not further allowed to infect and trouble this new colony. What Stuyvesant realized was that how a society treats its Jews is a litmus test. That if Jews were afforded the freedom to live there, it would create a domino effect. And soon Manhattan might become a bastion for all manner of religious dissenters. In Stuyvesant's own words, to give liberty to the Jews will be very detrimental. Giving them liberty, we cannot refuse the Lutherans and the Papists. You see, Stuyvesant was wrong on the morality, but he was right on the facts. The domino effect was real. His higher-ups in Holland denied his request to expel those Jews. And his worst fears were realized. Manhattan became a bastion of religious diversity. Consider 1787. The delegates of the Constitutional Convention wrote into the text of the Constitution a clause banning religious tests for office. This was a radical advance for religious freedom by the standards of the day. Consider that most American states at this time limited office holding to professing Christians or particular subsets of Christians. It shouldn't surprise us then that as Americans debated whether or not to ratify the Constitution, those opponents of the Constitution seized on the clause banning religious tests. They sought to catastrophize it, to weaponize religious bigotry in their bid to defeat the Constitution. And yet, the Constitution was ratified. In 1787, just as in 1654, religious bigotry towards Jews was inseparable from religious intolerance writ large. And in 1787, just as in 1654, in the face of intolerance, the voices of enlightenment won out. At a parade in Philadelphia on July 4th, 1788, to celebrate the ratification of the Constitution, the esteemed statesman Benjamin Rush observed, "The rabbi of the Jews, locked in the arms of two ministers of the gospel, was a most delightful sight. There could not have been a more happy emblem contrived of that section of the new Constitution which opens all its powers and offices alike, not only to every sect of Christians, but to worthy men of every religion." And so we see the fate of Jews bound up with the free exercise of religion for all Americans. And this history makes American Jewry distinct from European Jews. In Europe, when Jews were conferred or denied rights, it was usually done for Jews as a category. But in America, the Jewish struggle for free exercise has been part and parcel of a trans-denominational struggle to secure the blessings of religious freedom for all people. It is deeply telling that in our modern times, numerous judicial decisions protecting religious freedom for all kinds of denominations have cited George Washington's famous letter to the Jews of Newport in 1790, in which Washington famously declared that, quote, "the government of the United States gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance." Now, this letter is of world historical importance, not just for American Jews, but for Jewry at large, because this marks the first time anywhere in the world that a head of state recognized Jews as citizens. And so think about that. This letter has helped create the legal foundation for protecting the free exercise of Jews and Muslims and Catholics in America. I can think of no more fitting testament to the fundamental mutual interdependence of all of our religious liberties. The massacre at the Tree of Life Synagogue was the deadliest assault on American Jewry in 350 years of communal Jewish life on this continent. The long history of persecution against Jews tells us that usually this kind of carnage almost invariably foreshadows even deadlier assaults on Jews to come. Now, we have never before seen this kind of slaughter in a synagogue in America. We don't yet know what it means for the future of American Jewry. But if our history is any indication in this country, only in an America where Jews enjoy the right to worship freely is anyone's religious liberty secure. In closing, I'd like to return to the question I posed earlier. Can America be a home for its Jews in perpetuity? Jews have always had a certain optimism about America. In the early days of the Republic, a Jewish American sermonizer rang out, quote, "Collect together thy long scattered people of Israel, and let their gathering place be in this land of milk and honey. And gather they did. Jews came first by the thousands, and by the mid-19th century by the hundreds of thousands. And by Theodore Roosevelt's era, Jews were fleeing religious persecution and coming to what they called the Golden Land of America by the millions. Theodore Roosevelt was an imperfect president of an imperfect nation, but he knew his history. And when the Taft administration considered requiring American Jews to be identified as Hebrews on their passport, TR wrote, "I should no more have a man entered on a passport as a Hebrew than as an Episcopalian, or a Baptist, or a Roman Catholic." Roosevelt understood that the fate of religious liberty for Jewish Americans was inseparable from the fate of religious liberty for all Americans. Thank you.